The big picture framing that I want to give here is that there are many variables ranging from biological hormones to genetics to environmental influences, likely via epigenetics, which I also think is just an interesting consideration. I remember speaking to a geneticist once about he was sort of the leading expert on the nature nurture schizophrenia thing. And, I guess he was a geneticist. So he loved to point out that, well, I mean, with epigenetics, how could you say that it's not all genetics at the end of the day? Just like a neuroscientist might argue, well, the environment's important, certainly influences things, but, it's always going to manifest physiologically before you see a behavioral effect. Therefore, at some level, biology is still involved. But regardless, all of the, so which brings me to my point as a neuroscientist, all of these things, the cultural, societal, genetic, hormonal influences are all going to be integrated at some level within the brain to influence things such as our sexual differences, sexual orientation, and gender identity. There is really more variation within each sex when it comes to sexual differences than between the sexes for virtually all human behavior, meaning that there is considerable overlap between males and females for almost all behaviors. There are relatively small differences in behavior that can be statistically significant and are therefore often touted in the press as these big picture significant sex differences. And, which brings me back to my original thought, in terms of designing experimental studies and making this always an independent variable for every single study. I don't know that so often you're going to find this big difference. Here's a picture from your book trying to illustrate this phenomenon with females by sort of your mean normal distribution in red, males by the mean normal distribution in blue, with individual females, Alice and Mariko versus Jose and John. So the idea here is you might have a big sex difference here, but in reality, Alice and Mariko could be very different in the behavior or more different than Jose and John. One good example here is math. I mean, for the record, there's a multiple Nobel laureates, multiple members of the National Academy of Sciences that still hold by this idea that men should be overrepresented in STEM, in math, in engineering, and sciences because men are innately better at mathematics. And there are some statistics to back this up. For example, all of you took the SAT to get into college, and it turns out that boys generally outperform girls on the quantitative portion of the SAT in particular. However, there are a few caveats there. One, it turns out that scores do not actually predict performance in the math classes. There's an incredible amount of debate about SAT right now in general. Just my 2 cents there is that the SAT is really a good measure of your parents' academic history, more so than anything else, particularly the verbal section. If your parents have a good vocabulary, then you're going to do well on the verbal section of the SAT. So that obviously creates some systemic bias. But anyway, it is important to note that also, when boys are doing better in the US, they're also doing worse. This is particularly notable when you compare boys to, girls in Japan, areas in Southeast Asia as well, where girls tend to perform significantly better than American boys on the quantitative portion of the SAT. And I think this idea of sort of the stereotype is illustrated well down here in the cartoon to the left. You see someone struggling at math, and you might say, you could say, oh, you suck at math. Whereas if you tend to see a girl struggling at math, you might, for some reason, conclude that, well, maybe all girls suck at math. And I'd say this debate is continuing today and is something that you can think about and address. So what behaviors come to your mind that are most distinct between the sexes? I can tell you, as a parent with one boy and one girl, as parents often do, with a case study of one on each side. My son is much more rough and tumble. He is more physical. He wants to wrestle and much more active. He likes to, box and wrestle and these sorts of things more than my daughter. I guess those are two that come to my mind. Anybody else? Anyone want to dare to wade into the war of the sexes? Here are just some of the actual effect sizes that you see with a variety of behaviors that have been assessed. And you do see some moderate to large effects with some of these, like aggression and rough and tumble play. But note that most of these effects that we typically have big assumptions about are really, quite small. It's typically also said that, girls talk more, are more likely to, and certainly enough, my daughter certainly talks more than my son. But again, what effect of that is innate? What effect of that is social? I don't know. But in general, overall, the effect is small. And we often, I think, make most of our assumptions out of just parenting one or two children. And, it's not really representative of overall samples of variation, especially across society and culture. So, what does this have to do with gender roles? Well, this is where culture really comes into play. So, the assumption of gender roles are the assumption of culturally based behavioral patterns that are specific to one's own sex, and that would be the adoption of a gender role, and depending on the culture, I think you're seeing more and more, you can see a more blending of traditional gender roles. I would say that this is even evident in different regions of our own country. Interestingly, girls with congenital adrenal hyperplasia, which I know that you've already studied with Dr. Hamilton, and just for review, congenital adrenal hyperplasia is a alteration, sometimes genetic. It's incredibly rare, actually, but of the adrenals. But basically, you generally end up with increased amounts of androgens being released early on in development. But girls with congenital adrenal hyperplasia that are treated with hormones and are surgically corrected in terms of their genitalia still display some behavioral masculinization, suggesting that there are early structural distinctions. They are not activated in this case. And in girls with congenital adrenal hyperplasia, you observe increased rough and tumble play. You see less engagement in maternal care games, and you see less interested in jewelry and makeup. This might provide some very small evidence that early endocrine conditions can greatly shape the brain and how certain areas that are sexually dimorphic might form. Again, there's very little evidence to support this notion of, but we will get into some of the other very limited evidence to support that early things could change or influence, how the brain develops to result in sexual dimorphic, for example, areas of the preoptic area. So in review, there are thought to be organizational and activational effects. What I just described would be an example of an organizational effect. These are relatively permanent changes in response to exposure to hormones very early on in life during neural development. Activational effects, by contrast, are more reversible and occur during adulthood when hormones activate neural circuits that were previously developed. Gender identity is the process by which individuals come to view themselves as either male or female. Generally, this is considered to be established, often irreversibly, by the age of 2 years old. I think that there is some idea that this begins to occur later in life, but generally speaking, you can see distinctions in about 2% of the population is what the reviews on the subjects indicate. And that is across cultures. You can see distinctions in gender identity by 2 years of age in approximately 2% of the population, which also suggests that around 98% tend to show gender identity that is consistent with the sex of their rearing. That being said, 2% is not a small number. And I, reviewed the literature on this subject over the last couple of days. And I think in addition to 2% being, quite high, it's also worth noting that fewer than 2% of the population, at least historically, have come forward or identified as, being transgender. Over 98%, identify as cisgender traditionally, suggesting that historically there have been a lot of people that have not been properly identified. And here's just one of the studies, where I'm drawing some of these numbers from. This review by Kenneth Zucker. Studies suggest that the prevalence of self-reported transgender identity in children, adolescents, and adults ranges from 0.5 to 1.3%. I rounded up to 2%. Markedly higher than prevalence rates based on clinical referred samples of adults. And again, the 0.5 to 1.3% varies quite a bit when you look into it based on, society and where you are. But, sexual orientation, most studies have failed to find differences in sex steroids between homosexual and heterosexual men. Sexual orientation would be different than gender identity. Sexual orientation would basically be, your preferred, irrespective of your gender identity, your preferred orientation in sexual partner. If you do have a preferred sexual orientation, that is. So without a doubt, most studies have failed to find a difference in sex steroids between homosexual and heterosexual individuals. It isn't that heterosexuals have more testosterone than homosexuals. Not at all. However, there is still this idea or hypothesis that early exposure to hormones could influence feedback pathways, the brain structure, and also, in particular, positive and negative feedback loops. So some important points here are usually low doses of estrogens have a negative feedback effect on the secretion of gonadotropins in both sexes. Treatment with high doses of estrogens evokes a surge of luteinizing hormone and follicle stimulating hormone in women after initial suppression, which would be positive feedback. And homosexual men have greater positive feedback responses to estrogen treatment compared to heterosexual men, suggesting that the devil is in the details, that you could actually see differences in regulation, in homeostatic regulation through positive and negative feedback rather than overall levels of, for example, testosterone. However, as I've already alluded to, there are big limits here. If hormones are implicated in mediating human sexual orientation, then exposure to hormones early in development possibly are involved. But why has this not been studied in depth? It's very complicated and ethically difficult to do. How are you going to do this in people, first of all? I don't know of many IRB boards that would approve treating mothers that are pregnant with testosterone just to see what happens. Right. So, in addition, it's very difficult and dangerous to obtain samples of blood from a fetus of a human, all fetuses, but I mean, especially if there's no way you're going to get approval to do this for no reason, to a fetus or just an experimental reason. And animal models are of limited use in understanding sexual orientation. We are going to get to the homosexual sheep in a minute, but even with homosexual sheep, I think it's fair to say that homosexual sheep are different than homosexual people. That there are so many distinctions, not only biologically but also socially and culturally and environmentally, that all impact the brain and hormones to overall and feedback mechanisms to overall influence the behavioral phenotype of the individual human. So as I've already alluded to, 10%, it's really more around 8%. Again, I rounded up here, but 8% of male sheep show only male to male sexual activity. You can give them access to female rams that are in estrus or their sexually receptive period, ovulation, if you will. And they're just not interested. They do not mount, they do not ejaculate. Interestingly, homosexual ewes or the female sheep have not been identified, but then again, seeing how the primary dependent measure is mounting behavior, how would you really go about exploring that? Homosexual rams display estrogen binding in the amygdala that is similar to that of female rams or female sheep, and much less than that of heterosexual rams. Most importantly, in my opinion, there is a sexual dimorphic nucleus that has been discovered in the medial preoptic area of sheep. Treatment, in addition, treatment of pregnant ewes or the female sheep with testosterone during gestation resulted in larger sexually dimorphic nuclei in the medial preoptic area of the female offspring, suggesting that prenatal androgens might masculinize the brain or might predispose rams to be attracted to either females or other males. Here's essentially how they studied this. It's all, from one lab. I read the actual articles yesterday. They're quite fascinating, although I did find a few issues. There are issues in any scientific paper. Not so much like that they had issues. It's just that's not exactly the way I got it from the book. But so what they do here is they place the sheep in these little troughs that they cannot move from. However, there is a credible amount of tasty food inside these troughs. The sheep do not mind being in there at all. And then they leave the room. And for example, first, in the very first study, what they do is they, put 4 females in here and then put in a ram to see if they will mount the females. And the way that they study this also, I thought they had cameras, but they actually put some paint around the female to see if the paint is disturbed. But anyway, they can then identify and separate the around 10% of males that do not mount the females. And then they test them again in this sort of choice study where they give them 2 males and 2 females. And lo and behold, those that do not mount the females when presented with them do actually mount the males rather than the females, and also show increased ejaculation behavior. They then, in a follow-up study, so D is actually from one paper from this group, C is from a follow-up study that they did, in which they treated females that were pregnant with testosterone, and then looked at the brains of the offspring, because in their first study, they looked at the preoptic area and showed or found that there was a sexually dimorphic nucleus. You can see this, basically the results from the first 2 columns in this graph in C, that females have a smaller noticeable area in the medial preoptic area that they call the sexual dimorphic nucleus. And then if you treat pregnant animals or the pregnant sheep with testosterone, it masculinizes the female preoptic area. The female's preoptic area is larger. In fact, it's larger than any group. And the male actually does not change in size, suggesting that there is a ceiling effect that, it can only go so high. But, they were able to alter the size of the sexually dimorphic nucleus. So I started reading this because, there are a few interesting things in here that I wanted to see. I mean, like first, if you treat the mother with estrogen, which you probably could not do because it would alter, the birth of the offspring. So I don't know that you can even do that experiment, but obviously I wanted to know if that produced more of a homosexual ram. So that study has never been done, and I don't know that it can be done due to the role of estrogen in the birthing process. But one surprising thing here, and I also wanted to see, well, what about the behavior? So I mean, obviously you cannot really have clear mounting effects of the females treated with testosterone, but what do they look like? And I was a little disappointed to find that in C, these volumes were actually taken from the fetus rather than the developed offspring. So I would also love to see what this looks like actually after neural development, although I guess one could argue that a lot of neural development has already happened in the fetal period. But still, I would love to see what it actually looks like, by the time that sexual behavior begins to emerge. Still, very interesting work and some of the rare work that has been done on the subject in a very rare species that allows for that. So what about sex differences in cognitive abilities? There is no direct evidence that sex differences in brain morphology mediate human behavioral sex differences in cognition. Keeping that in mind, there are several sex differences in cognitive abilities that are consistently observed cross-culturally and are therefore good candidates to be differences mediated primarily by physiological factors like sex steroid hormones. Females have a lower threshold and display less tolerance to painful stimuli than males. Females have fewer mu opioid receptors in the spinoparabrachial pain pathway than males. Boys and girls have similar pain detection until puberty, suggesting that this is adaptive. And I find this incredibly interesting. I think that that's a typical male response to this graph. Oh, that's interesting. Whereas I think my wife, when I said, "Oh, that's interesting," my wife was like, "No, this isn't interesting. This just sucks." But this is, I think, very important for everyone to understand, and that is that changes in pain perception vary across the menstrual cycle. Perception of pain seems to be more intense for women when estrogen levels drop off, like in the luteal phase right before menstruation, suggesting that some of the cramping, some of the discomfort that occurs is partially due to just increased sensitivity of pain and general everything being worse. So, right. I think a very important takeaway for everyone. Olfaction, we also see differences in olfaction. Women are 1,000 times more sensitive to musk-like odors than men. And this difference begins at puberty and has been shown to be estrogen dependent. Yeah, forget the pheromone cologne, guys. Get the musk flavor scent. fMRI studies have shown that women's brains activate in a different pattern to olfactory stimuli, and really in a few sensory stimuli or sensory modalities. I'll show you some fMRI images from a different modality in a minute. But in general, women's brains are activated in a different pattern, often more of a bilateral pattern than men. Periovulatory women and women in early pregnancy show enhanced olfactory sensitivity. There are many reasons that this could have evolved for. Can anybody think of any? Why would this be a benefit? Why would this be
for like protecting the pregnancy in case there was be more sensitive to when something tastes off in order to protect pregnancy?
Absolutely. That's the biggest conclusion that most people reach. And my wife has given me permission to tell this story, so she typically teaches this class. And, when she was presenting this slide once, this very slide, when she was pregnant with my son, our second child. When presenting this slide, just the thought of this made her sick and nauseous, and she ran out into the hallway of North Classroom and threw up in the hallway. And then we had not announced yet that she was pregnant, so she just walked back into the class and was like, "Class dismissed. We'll pick this up another day." Yeah, and I find that an interesting story, at least. And in terms of periovulatory women, the idea here is that you want to sniff out the best seed. Women with irregular menstrual cycles also exhibit reduced olfactory sensitivity. There are also taste differences. Women display more sensitivity on taste tests than men. They tend to be superior at naming tastes and discriminating tastes, especially bitter. They also have a tendency towards sweet taste. These differences arise after puberty, suggesting that they are somewhat activated, are exaggerated during pregnancy and in the follicular phase of the menstrual cycle, and are diminished somewhat after menopause. Female rodents and primates display estrogen-dependent preferences for sweet tastes. In rodents, we know this is to be organized by the lack of perinatal androgens and activated by estrogens in adulthood. There are also big differences in audition or hearing. Women hear pure tones at lower thresholds than men, particularly at higher frequencies. This occurs at all ages, suggesting that it is somewhat innate. Tolerance to white noise is significantly lower in females than in males, although I can tell you that I'm still very sensitive to white noise myself. Although I'll also point out that this was tested when most tested after the birth of my first child, my daughter. At the time, I was working in a research lab where one of my colleagues, had this. She was from the University of Bordeaux, and I guess was trained to think that to really care about potential auditory confounds. So she insisted that we have white noise in the lab at all times in every room because the animals would pass through the rooms. So at work, I was exposed to white noise the entire time I was there. And we also at home set up white noise. So the idea is that white noise simulates the sound of the womb and is soothing to the infant. So I was exposed to white noise for 24 hours a day, and I grew to hate, loathe white noise. I still find it aversive. But it's also worth noting that my hormones would have changed a little bit because I was a nester and bonded, very tightly with my daughter, and gained a white pudge, the whole 9 yards. So some of it's possible that I showed increased sensitivity to white noise. Although that would suggest activation, and this behavior, at least in women, isn't thought to be due to activation. But regardless, women are better at hearing particular sounds, which gives us a great excuse, guys, for our selective hearing. Remember that you have this cop out, it's neurobiological. There's a neurobiological basis. I didn't hear, sorry. Yes. But one way that this is studied is what's known as clicks, which are also abbreviated CEOAEs. Clicks are actually not clicks. It's the ear's response to a sound, but I'm just going to call them clicks because it's a lot easier to say than CEOAEs. Ears produce faint echo-like noises generated by the cochlea of the inner ear called clicks. Clicks are also what are used to assess by the audiologist to see if you've had inner ear damage or would be a candidate for cochlear implants. Oh, speaking of cochlear implants, I don't know if anybody's watched the movie Sound of Metal yet. Sound of Metal just came out. It's about a musician, a punk rock musician, really more than a metal musician, but they still called it the Sound of Metal. But he lost his hearing, and it's all basically about that. And that the sound editing is amazing in this movie, and I think it really does an excellent portrayal of what it would actually be like to go deaf. Fascinating movie, excruciating to sit through in some levels because it's like you feel you empathize so much with the protagonist. And the sound editing is meant to drive you crazy. It sort of simulates what it would be like to lose hearing. And, I couldn't call it a pleasant experience, but certainly a eye-opening experience or ear-opening experience, if you will, if you can sort of sit through it. It's sort of one of those just beautifully painful movies. But anyway, women have louder clicks than men. The sex difference is present from birth, suggesting innate organizational effects rather than activational ones. However, there are a few interesting findings here. Women with twin brothers have more male-like clicks. Hard to exactly say why, but obviously there could be unique embryonic interaction that could influence. Homosexual and bisexual women produce weaker clicks than heterosexual women, and oral contraceptives appear to masculinize clicks in women. Ah, yes, and from the animal literature, female hyenas that are exposed to high androgen concentrations in utero have masculinized clicks. Again, supporting this idea that early exposure to androgens or hormonal influences could drastically influence the masculinization or feminization of the brain. Uh, Again, just some supportive evidence here. The evidence is scant in general. Take all of this with somewhat of a grain of salt, but this is the latest, greatest, newest scientific literature to date, and I think is groundbreaking. However, as a scientist, I'm always skeptical and want to see more. And there is a dearth of evidence, and it's really hard to study. Here are you can see graphs of people based on their sexual identity with dependent measure of clicks or the ear's amplitude response to sound in women, lesbians, gay men, and men. And as you can see, men are less responsive to sound than women. And then at the top, you can see that lesbians show a trend toward being more masculinized in this regard. And female sheep that were treated, if their mothers were treated with testosterone while they were in utero, they show an extremely masculinized response that really surpasses the male response. It was also interesting to me that you saw the same effect in the size of the sexual dynamorphic nucleus in the preoptic area. That recall that the female sheep whose mothers who had been treated with testosterone in utero had the largest preoptic area, even larger than the males. So, very interesting finding to me. Oh yeah, and also of note, males in which the mother were treated with testosterone showed no distinction from regular males. Suggest again, and I think all of this is related to how important homeostatic balance is in hormones. And when you think of positive and negative feedback and these sorts of things, and you might be just more likely to encounter a ceiling effect in the male with testosterone, and a big shift in effect where the homeostatic system has just been thrown out of alignment or homeostasis. This is a fascinating chart that I'm not going to make you memorize necessarily, but I do want you to consider the big picture here, because it is very important that you think about the different stages at which masculinization or feminization of the auditory system can occur. And while this is just one system, and one should not necessarily conflate it to overall, gender identity or sexual orientation, it, I think might be a beneficial model at some level. Just again, be cautious about conflating too much. But in general, I think conflating too much in regard to biology, social factors, gender identity, and sexual orientation is a fraught endeavor. because it's complicated. And that's really the point of this chart. There are various genetic pre and postnatal environmental influences that can influence prenatal androgen exposure. And if any of these are high or weak, that can result in the masculinization or the feminization of the auditory system, which can result in more or less sensitive hearing. Again, I see it as sort of like a beautiful analogy of what it might be like in other ways of development. But again, here there are multiple influences: environmental, social, hormonal, biological, all working together. The physiology, the brain is that final domino. It is certainly a domino that all of these factors flow through. Like, you cannot have a social or environmental influence on behavior without going through the brain that I am aware of. However, these are distinct from one's innate genetics.
I have a question.
Please.
Do you think, or have you seen any literature that relates clicks to maybe, like, I don't know how this would be measured, but maybe receptivity of masculine versus feminine voices? Like, is there...
I know enough to know that literature exists.
Okay.
More into it if you shoot me an email reminder. It's not something that I'm able to cite chapter and verse on. However, I'm certainly aware that literature exists, and there are differences in like the depth. I'm probably saying the wrong word there, but the depth, how deep the tone is in identifying it between the sexes. So I am aware of such things, but I hesitate to give you an answer without researching it further.
Yeah, that makes sense. I wonder if there's any additional literature about voice development of somebody. I wonder if there's, like, I don't know, do you know if there's like an audio feedback loop in one's development of their own voice?
Another excellent question. In terms of an audio feedback loop, I don't know. I guess I would be willing to guess that the one's voice would be greatly influenced by the development of the auditory system in response to genetics interacting with other social factors. And whether or not one's own voice feeds back into that, I don't know. Especially when you think of it along a developmental trajectory. Uh, most, and this would be a great question for Joan Bayun, by the way. And you might have learned, someone else in the class might have the answer to this, and please speak up if you do. But, I would assume that a lot of the brain structures responsible for voice development. And I mean, some of that has to do with also just activation and thickening of the vocal cords in terms of depth. But, some of the actual brain auditory structures that might be involved, I would posit to guess that they are developed before language actually begins to even manifest. So I don't know how much feedback would be involved.
Yeah, just curious to hear what your thoughts were.
Yeah, no, curiosity. Yeah, if there's only one thing that I am as a teacher, I hope to be thought-provoking. So yes, more thoughts and questions, the better. Please keep them coming. Anybody else have any thoughts on that they can bring in from child psych, from developmental? I mean, I haven't taken child psych in 30 years. Well, no, probably more like 25 years. So I mean, like, that's fresher on your guys' minds than mine. Well, shoot me an email reminder, and I can follow up on that a little bit more. I'm curious myself, but have a million things on my mind, and working toward a very important deadline due tonight. But after tonight, tomorrow, after I fill out my bracket in the morning, I can devote some attention to that. Anybody filling out a bracket, by the way? NCAA basketball. I lived in North Carolina for a while. It's a big deal there. Colorado's in the tournament. They're probably going to lose. They're playing Georgetown. All right, male rats have 20% more neurons in the primary visual cortex than females. And when you expose a female rat to DHT from birth and show inhibited cell death, you observe inhibited cell death in the primary visual cortex. I have to go back to it one more time. The brackets, I really, really miss Barack Obama being president and filling out the brackets. I would always just wait and love to compare my bracket to his bracket. He still, I'm sure, will publish his bracket if he hasn't already. I can't look before I fill out my own, and then I will compare them. But yeah, I don't know. I always found several things that he did very humanizing and relatable. And yeah, I don't know. I like that guy. But anyway, lateralization is the tendency for cognitive skills to be concentrated in one hemisphere. Lateralization is one thing that I don't know an incredible much about. Lateralization is something that I think Carly Leonard, or a cognitive psychologist in the department, could tell you a lot more than I do. I admit that it is one of my weaknesses. And I also, will even tell you that I guess I was somewhat biased against some of it. In part, Broca, the famous sort of neuropsychologist Broca, was one of the first to make a lot of strong hypotheses about lateralization, especially in regard to handedness. And I don't know how much some of those have borne out. So I think there's still quite a bit of confusion out there about lateralization and handedness in particular. That being said, there are certainly some, and a lot of lateralization is most apparent in like cortical functions. And that's just not something that we study much in rats. So it's not something that I study frequently. It's something you see cognitive psychologists study a lot more in people. But we are people, and I think we want to understand sex differences in people more so than rats, which also brings me back to the importance of studying sexual differences in rats versus people, and how important it might really be in very narrow effects where you might see more intravariability within a sex in between. But anyway, female cognitive function is generally more evenly distributed between the hemispheres, which I think is a fascinating observation in and of itself. You will also find a lot of debate in this literature as to whether or not having greater lateralization in the brain is better or worse for example, psychiatric development. It could also be related to, maybe somewhat related to, there are probably a lot of things that go into it, but I don't know. Anybody ever hear the wimpy white boy phenomenon? Wimpy white boy phenomenon? Any takers? So if you ever go to the NICU of a hospital, the neonatal intensive care unit, one thing that you will observe is that most of the babies in there are white boys, suggesting that for whatever reason, it could have to do with the white chromosome, the Y chromosome. It could be due to, more white parents in the United States delaying childbirth for various reasons, and then resorting to more abnormal means of becoming pregnant. There are a lot of reasons for it, but also just sheerly genetically that, and there's an interesting evolutionary theory which is that evolutionarily, it makes sense to kill off more of the seed than the female. That, you know, you only need a few alpha males to breed and populate. But for whatever reason, you know, there are a lot more sort of sickly boys than girls. And there is also an interesting racial phenomenon with this in America. But anyway, it's also a very interesting thing that I think about when I think of sex differences in humans in America. But some of that, I don't know if lateralization at all plays a role there, but it could very well influence a variety of psychiatric disorders, which I guess we'll sort of end on the last slide here. Hopefully I get there. I guess I will if I stop getting off topic and talking about brackets and nonsense like that. But where was I? Lateralization. You know, female cognitive function tends to be more evenly distributed between both hemispheres. Interestingly, there's also a right ear advantage where, in general, both sexes detect sounds better from the right ear than the left ear, which makes sense, as you know, there's typically processing on the opposite side of the brain. And Broca and Wernicke's area, both areas necessary in recognition and development of speech, associated, I think, with what is it, Brodmann's area 45 or 44 in primates. But regardless, these exist in the left hemisphere. And in general, men are much slower and make more mistakes when responding to auditory information arriving at the left ear than women. Review the fun little song my wife and I made on this that highlights this, amongst other sex differences, which are a little more relevant now than when I sent out the video. But I think it's nice to sort of start the session or semester on a more fun, entertaining note, rather to sort of curb the dread that can sometimes accompany a new class and new professor. Humanizing. But anyway, here I'm going back to our click graph and now bringing in left and right ear. Black bars represent left ear, right ears represent right ear. As you can see across all independent measures, the right ear is more sensitive to the sound in comparison to the left ear. And this is particularly notable in females. Going back to lateralization, prenatal steroid hormones affect lateralization patterns. One example of this would be that in women with Turner's syndrome, which is a syndrome in which women do not secrete steroid hormones prenatally and do not exhibit lateralization of auditory information. You know, in this case, women exposed to androgens in utero display a masculinized lateralization pattern in the brain. The left hemisphere in general weighs more and is larger than the right hemisphere, but the weight difference is less pronounced in females than in males. There's extreme controversy in the literature regarding whether or not there are sexually differences in the corpus callosum. So I'm not going to steer opinion one way or the other there. Just know that there is a literature on it and people argue, which is science. It's a good thing. Verbal skills are one variable that women particularly excel at. Again, these sex differences tend to be more minor than extreme. But females generally display better language comprehension, faster language acquisition, better spelling and verbal fluency and grammar skills than men. That just gives me a lot of excuse here, right? Again, I have a lecture excuse. It's neurobiological. I can't help it, guys. Sapolsky is a freak of nature. These sex differences arise after puberty, making it likely to be mediated by hormonal factors. Broca's area is 20% larger in women than men. Again, a very interesting neuroanatomical distinction. Which of these is from a male brain listening to someone talk, which is from a female? The left is to the male, as you probably guessed, the one with more unilateral than bilateral activation. In addition, women outperform men on tests of perceptual speed, fine motor coordination, and mathematical calculations. I don't know if anybody, what was the name of that movie? Where basically about the space wars and the US, Hidden Figures, that's the one, Hidden Figures. I think an excellent example of this, even when, we still had very stark gender roles in terms of vocations in the country. Even then, they had human female computers, right? Doing the mathematics in the background. And often found that women were better at this than the men. But men outperform women on tests of target-directed motor skills, mathematical reasoning, and mentally rotating of objects. Postmenopausal women receiving testosterone supplements perform better than estrogen-treated women in map memory tests. Male rodents learn mazes faster and make fewer errors than females. It'll be interesting to see how that changes. In general, our hippocampal size which is important for spatial memory, are shrinking, it turns out, as we do not really have to rely on maps anymore and spatial navigation. I argue that this is a good thing and allows greater growth of other areas like the cortex. Some people freak out about it all, but regardless, the hippocampus is 10% larger in male rodents than females, where the sex difference in spatial abilities is present. There are also differences in art and the amount of colors that we use in producing art. This is a graph from your book showing the color of crayons that boys and girls gravitate toward when drawing. Interestingly, girls tend to use more reds, pinks, fleshy colors than boys, who tend to gravitate more toward blues. So stereotypical, huh? You also see differences in not only in the colors that they choose, but also how they draw and the perspective with which they draw. I think one of the most interesting things to me is boys tend to have more sort of an overhead perspective and pile objects on top of one another, suggesting, leading to questions such as, do boys and girls perceive the world differently, or are they expressing things differently? This is from your book. The middle graphs are from girls. The B and C are from girls that had masculinized brains from increased androgen during development. And F and G are from boys. You can see both the overhead perspective very clearly here, and also distinctions in color and type of things that they're drawing. And finally, I want to add that there are distinctions here that might be very relevant for psychiatric disorders. Certain psychiatric disorders are expressed more in men than women. Some of this could be related to genetics, bilateralization in neurodevelopment, maybe wimpy white boy syndrome, who knows? And I did want to say one last thing here that came to my mind when thinking about this in particular, with the overhead view and spatial organization. You know, at one point during, I guess during the downsides of graduate school, I considered a variety of different things as alternative careers to being a scientist and professor. One, I thought about being a teacher in inner city high schools, especially during Obama's presidency, where he was sort of touting the non-traditional inner city high school, sort of something I got very excited about. I also briefly thought about going, switching to law school. And also, I thought about enlisting as an officer in the military. In the Air Force in particular. And I took the officer training test, which is really a fascinating test. But I've got to tell you, it's like there are certain parts that seem very, biased toward the male. In particular, there's this like little block organization thing, and you know my wife, she's a genius. Like so she typically makes the perfect scores on these things. So it's like I would give her a section, and she would be able to knock it out of the park. And really, the only section that I was able to perform better than her on, and that's with me studying and her not studying, is the block organization thing, which is really sort of a silly thing when you think about it. But yeah, it's like what blocks are touching each other, and like how do you view that from top down and these sorts of things. I don't know if anybody else has taken that test, but it's a very interesting one. Yeah, the standardized tests are all very different. I've flirted with most of them and taken a lot of them, and don't really love any of them. And think that there's just incredible bias and systemic issues with all of them. But anyway, I have a lot of experience with them, which is good as a college professor, because I also can give advice on how to prepare and these sorts of things really across the gamut of them.